All right. Welcome to Complex Systems and Game Theory. Thanks for coming, everyone, to continue to talk about complex systems and game theory. And it should be a super fun and interesting discussion. When we last left off, we were reading Finite and Infinite Games. We were learning a little bit about Bayes' theorem and team games, basically. So, I wanted to kind of open up and start talking about things in finite and infinite games. Who's got some insights from their reading of finite and infinite games that they want to share? What stood out to you from this chapter?
The part of the chapter that stood out was about sense of self and being a part of community, that we can't form ourselves without being part of playing the game with others. Really, it's a self-definition cycle that was really emotionally profound to me as well as just on a systems level. But it really resonated.
Cool. Yeah, Gene, what did you think?
The thing that kind of struck out to me was talking about how individual people can seem like they act in a really, really selfish, almost like dickish way, but it almost supports the group's goals, and in doing like what they do, they're helping like the bigger structure kind of thrive or achieve whatever goal they have.
Yeah, instrumental convergence or goal convergence. Yeah. What other insights do we have?
It's kind of difficult to use. There's a lot of them. I thought that there was a really interesting section on athletes being held aloft as if they have like achieved, and so they then are being supported because of their achievements. And then that made me think of like the way that people act towards disability and the way that they're like really angry towards disabled people for like getting everything for free. And it's kind of the inverse of that, because they see the athlete as deserving basically having to do nothing because of their achievements in the past. So they should be supported and stuff. And then when people like, so that's like a way that people express someone being worthwhile and having done something and earned a title. But then disabled people are kind of like, I guess, in the finite player's eyes, like just getting the rewards without having done the work beforehand. And so they get really like horrible about it because they've got these like systems in their heads.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like there is a big distinction between society and culture that was drawn. Anybody feel like they could describe that?
It's kind of a paradoxical statement. I think it said that like in order for like a society's culture to live on, they have to understand that the society is the culture, but like also nobody really knows that. I think the like one of the weird analogies that he made was like people can choose to be Americans, but no one person can choose to be America. So there's a lot of weird inverse relationships and how they actually identify as a culture.
Yeah, in the book we talk a lot about culture versus society, and so we're defining culture here as the way that people do things now in relation. And so culture is viewed as the infinite game. Culture changes in response to what's going on in the world around you, versus society, which is an agreement by all players participating in culture. And it's a finite game, right? A nation is society, but a culture are the people who live in that place. And a nation may fall, but the people are still there participating in the culture. Or a nation might not exist anymore, and yet people are still proud to be part of that culture, right? The nation that comprised ancient Greece is fallen and risen so many times, but still people are proud to be part of an ancient culture, even though they are not part of the same society they once were. So there's a big, key focus in the book, Finite and Infinite Games, on the, which parts of our daily life are an infinite game versus a finite game, right? And so a nation is a finite game. It has a beginning. When was our nation founded? And it has an end. When did it fall? Even if it has not fallen yet, it's merely a game that is still in play. And the goal is to play the nation as long as possible, but at some point, all players do agree that the nation has ended and that there is a new one now, and it's called something else. Similar name, maybe, ruled by the same people even sometimes, but it's a new thing. And so a society is a finite version of an infinite culture, right? So, yeah, and then that kind of gets into, property, like the notion of property rights is something that belongs to which thing?
As in society or culture, or finite or infinite games? Well, it belongs to society and finite games.
Right.
It's like a property is like title, and it's like the ultimate expression of title. And it's like property has to be imposing, and it has to continue to impose on people to have relevance. And it has to take up space. Yeah. Which made me think about like, when they were selling houses in the metaverse, and people were like, why would you buy a house in the metaverse? Even though it's like, I don't know, I think that's why people had that reaction, because the houses in the metaverse don't impose on anyone, so they don't have any prestige. Even though you can spend time in them because it's in the metaverse and you're basically there. But it doesn't have any prestige, and it doesn't impose on others, so it doesn't have any like relevance within the finite societal context.
Like people getting kind of peeved or like unsettled by people buying houses in the meta universe kind of sounds like the anger that comes from thinking that people didn't deserve it, in which like the amount of time that you've possessed it, or like how much you had to like give to possess it, like those things, they didn't earn it. So like having the same like title, or like the honor from a title, seems so like almost seems like dishonorable, I guess. Kind of putting the words.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Matthew?
Oh, yeah, just after Gene was. Yeah, that's so interesting in regards to virtual spaces, because in virtual spaces, really, they're, how do I say this? That in this phase of VR, it's often virtual spaces are created by culture, these cultural artifacts. A lot in the initial tries at VR, like even this like Walmart, let's be shopping, this idea of what is shopping is culture in a way, right? And so that also it's this weird position of like home ownership is this cultural phenomenon, right? And we're playing that out in this weird recreation infinite game, I suppose, inside VR, right? But and then we're trying to play that out, and I think that some of the, like you're saying, some of the backlash comes from that, but we're really just playing with the same cultural artifacts underneath, and then that's often what comes up in new technologies. It's the theater into film, pieces of culture break off and then kind of morph into new things, right? And that's the infinite game. That's what I'm really excited about. But yeah, this chapter really showed me that the infinite game causes anger for certain other finite games.
True. Yeah. I think the nice thing we get into there is, just to kind of dig into that part, you have the cultural practice of home ownership, which is a ritual that we culturally engage in as someone who moves out or achieves some certain level of cultural like relevance, right? But then we have a societal notion of home ownership, in which homes are a title that you earn in the finite game of whether or not you own a home in this nation or you are a renter, right? And these are different titles that, again, are largely about your valor in the finite game of society. Like, how much money did you earn for how long? So whether or not you can get a mortgage from the banks, which is really just a title to a house that the bank gives you in recognition of your ability to earn money over time, which is really just about valor in the current society. But then when we took it to the multiverse, there was or not multiverse, metaverse, there was a bunch of problems that came up, right? One, it's not conspicuous. You can't force someone to acknowledge your metaverse house, because if they're just like, yeah, I don't metaverse, then it just isn't relevant to them. And so there's no way to societally incept on people who have not chosen to participate, your entitlement, right, to that place in the metaverse. And so, and then the other thing that comes up is that same thing around that comes up with people who have disabilities, right? It's the same feeling that these people did not earn the grand entitlement that they have been given, because this form of currency, they only, it's only worth something because they got in early and not because they did something valorous, there we go. And so they didn't earn home ownership, but they're over here doing the rituals, which by definition in the book makes the metaverse art. Who wants to talk about the definition of art in the books?
No, I know I loved all the art stuff, because I have always had this feeling that, I mean, this is going to be controversial, but like a lot of the conversations around AI art and artists saying, but you're stealing my art. And I've always kind of considered that people are like making commissions for others, like in a financial exchange, isn't art. And I don't think it's art. And that, I know people generally don't like that, but I think like capital and like the involvement of like economics in art completely strips it of meaning. Because to me, I've always thought of it as it's like a way of expressing and sending a message. And if someone else is paying you to send their message, then you're not sending a message. So it's not, in a way, the person paying you is the artist. You're not the artist. So yeah, and then it got in really deep into like the way that societies like use artists and poets to like support the kind of the status quo, and that it's not done through force, it's done through poets and artists, and they can be kind of basically bribed with like valor and property and things to tell the story of the society. But Plato said that poets and artists were really dangerous, basically because they point out that the thing is a game, and like that's the most dangerous thing to the society, is for someone to be like, not to be like, this person in power is wrong, I'm going to oppose them, but to be like, this is nonsense. This is all just nonsense. Like, we're all just playing this nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. We could just stop playing right now, and then things would be less bad. And that's really dangerous to states. So then they start wars.
Right. Artists are the only people who can call for an end to the game, because their sacred role within a society is to point out the rules of the society and our free choice to participate in the society. And I believe it sort of defines any art that is commissioned for a specific message is really propaganda, right? And so commissioned art, though it requires a skill, and workers should be compensated for their work, especially within society. Workers are compensated for the time that they put forward into their work, right? And so when you see the artist as a worker, the artist is not producing art. The artist is merely technically skilled at reproduction of propaganda. But when you don't have to be technically skilled to do art, right? Like in this, what is art really? If art is not propaganda, it is. So artists do not create objects, but create by way of objects, right? So artists are not makers of actualities, but makers of possibilities, right? For example, we could, be real basic and talk about Banksy, right? What is Banksy's artistic thesis? What are they trying to do by Banksying about?
Just because Banksy's from Bristol.
Yeah, do it.
And there's a Banksy like literally just down the end of the road. I mean, what Banksy is supposedly trying to do is to like repurpose public spaces and like reclaim them to stop advertising and instead send political messages, which is, I guess, kind of like the original intent. It's maybe gone on a bit long, and so it's got to the point where it's quite formulaic and not very controversial anymore, and also there's a weird thing where the art becomes property, and then like people like the one down most over there has like as soon as it went up, they put things around it, they put a case on it, and then they get ready to sell it, and it becomes property. So
it ceases to be
art.
Right. The act of making the art appear on the building, the statement that was made through the interaction of, I put this art up somewhere, was the art. But the paint on the bricks, it's not the art. And like a Banksy print is not art, it is an object. Right? And it reminds you of the artistic movement. It can be a symbol that in your mind can stand for it. But when you destroy it, that concept is unchanged. And that's really, I think, the art that's defined in the text is the concept that remains unchanged, irrespective of the physical work.
I was gonna like mention like one of the influences of Banksy just being that like it was a symbol for, I guess, like subverting the corporate art landscape almost. Like, oh, let's go ahead and just commoditize our works. And like in a way, the process of creating art is also it's like playing into the infinite game. Unless I guess, yeah, you are commissioned to do something, then you have an end goal that, benefits someone else's finite game.
Right. So a big element to the art is what if you see someone and at their house they have a Banksy print on the wall. What does that mean about that person today? I mean it. Like they have it on the wall today. What does it mean about them in 2024? April of 23. Or no, 24. It's the 23rd of the 24. Anyway.
Status of participation that like cultural value. You have monetary value, but also culture. Like, oh, there's this other cultural status value, status symbol, and also art is about the infinite game and about questioning it and pushing the boundaries of the infinite game. But within this context, you can be the arbiter of like that infinite game somewhat, because this is the best painting and it has the most value and you have it and you can define what is. I think art is inherently queering the lines, right? So maybe it could be that print could be art, like I would say, because the art is towards the infinite game. So it depends like what players within what gaming, which players, and maybe that print is art within that game, right? But I think it is a status symbol, but also you're the arbiter of that game, or the supposed arbiter within society.
I think by that person that has that Banksy painting in their house, they're extending Banksy's game in a way because they're kind of proving his point. Like, why are you hanging this shit up in your house? This is like a joke almost, and it's art technically.
I was just gonna be like, they're just like a what's like an abomination. Like to just like have something like that on your wall, which is like specifically against the intended decryption of the artist, like is like either neglectful or like malicious to culture, because you know that Banksy. The point is, especially a lot of Banksy's work are like in situ works, like almost all of them are like specifically placed in the, so to take them out of their context and then sell them is like it's bad. I don't know if it's evil, but it's
It does
maybe
violence.
within the context of the book, like the book does like throw the word evil around, so maybe the author would say it's evil.
Yeah, it does do violence to the concept.
Yeah.
So these are all actually very important points, right? We had the recognition of the original message from one person. We had the subversion of the message and the participation of the fact that it was subversion of the message. And then there was the fact that this is ripped out of situ does violence to the work. All of those takes, the interaction there is the artistic piece and is what makes the Banksy art still art, even though that object hanging in that person's house is not art. The object hanging in the house, the fact that it hangs in the house, what it says, and y'all's interaction with it is the art part. It is the cultural element. It is the infinite game that cannot be contained within the fact that a person has spent money on a Banksy print. That's the society game, right? And so the interaction, the fact that that has changed. Initially, if you had a Banksy print, you were like in the know about cool graffiti. Even though you took it out of situ, it was a reference point. It meant something. And then that got changed. And then that got changed again. And then it got changed again. And not everyone has updated their belief because culture. Because the people who have a Banksy print like that Matthew is exposed to are of a certain group. And the people that have a Banksy print that Roan is exposed to are of a different group, because of your physical locations in the world and the societies that you regularly participate in, all of which are finite games.
I think like at one point, like those two groups might be able to, I guess, see on a more similar page their desire to have it, just because they're. So I'm going to jump to the other part of the reading real quick, where I think it was called preference construction. Like you see other people like forming more desire to have this thing, or like people are gossiping about it. Now it becomes more elusive. So you're going to adjust like how determined you are to go get it. If enough people have the thing that you want, okay, so then make it a little harder to get it. But like people are also like working off of criteria for different reasons. Like if you wanted specifically the Banksy print, then your reason for getting it probably was just to seem like, you were hot shit, that you had money. But yeah.
That was great. Thank you for that, like tying that together, because I'm glad you saw it. Yeah. Yeah, the other part of the reading, the chapter 5 about team reasoning and conditional games, they're very tied together, right? There's this game. Has anyone heard of the Stag Hunt game? Anyone can define Stag Hunt for me? So the Stag Hunt game, I'll read it, is another classical game that big, complicated society-level games compose down into a bunch of different games. Prisoner's Dilemma is that one game that we've heard of, but Stag Hunt is another game. Stag Hunt is about social cooperation. So two hunters must decide separately whether, without the other knowing, whether to hunt a stag or a hare. Both hunters know the only way to successfully hunt a stag is with the other's help. So they know that if they choose to hunt the stag, they have to have the other's help. One hunter can catch a hare alone with less effort, and less time. So the hunters know if they choose to pick the hare, they'll get something, and they won't go home hungry, and it's less effort and time. But it's just a hare and not a full stag, which could keep you fed for weeks or months. So both hunters would be better off if both chose the more ambitious and more rewarding goal. But both hunters would, and give up some autonomy in exchange for the other hunter's cooperation and added might. The situation is often seen as a useful analogy for many kinds of social cooperation, such as international agreements on climate change, right? So we run into this. There's this thing called instrumental convergence, right? Or conditional preferences. So if you have to choose alone whether or not you'll hunt the hare or the stag, and you don't know how the other hunter is going to choose, your best bet is to go for the more cooperative one, still, because it's probable that they'll pick that one because of the increased payoff. So it's kind of the opposite of the prisoner's dilemma. It's where the choice is obvious that we should cooperate rather than, pollute the water or do whatever it is, right? It helps all of us to cooperate, even though we have to give up a little bit of control. And so that's part of it. And it really explores the fusion of agency versus the sublimation of agency, right? Society, as a finite game, is the sublimation of agency, while culture, as an infinite game, is the fusion of agency. Think about a band, I don't get to play whatever notes I want to play, right? We're not an improvisational jazz band. We're going to play songs people recognize and play them over and over again. And it helps us all to do so, even though we have to give up autonomy over what notes we're playing right now. Right? So we see this game all over the place. And in bigger games, sometimes they can be broken down into smaller games. And so that's a big one. So the formal, social utility of something comes into play a lot in the infinite versus finite game, right? The social utility of something, usually we're talking about a finite game. We're talking about, we as a team, we're going to get together and decide on a strategy. One of several strategies, but we're all going to decide. So how do we determine that strategy, right? Does anyone, when you're getting together and you're trying to decide what's the next thing that we are going to do, what do you usually do? How does that usually go?
Is this considering that the team is freshly hatched, but you're all united by a certain goal, or?
Yeah, that's an important consideration. You can assume that you can't actually know that information, right? Because what we want to do is sort of think about this in the general case, right? So obviously there is an input there, whether or not we all feel affinity for the team's goal versus competition, right? And so if we feel like we're competing, we're going to play the stag hunt game, right? But if we don't, we might play this game called high-low, where that can kind of degenerate and go poorly because we want to hurt our competitors strategically so that we get the highest take, basically. So it's a good thing to bring up. So let's say that you don't know how much allegiance anyone in the group has to the team, right? It's different over time, but you're just in a group with 5 random strangers and you've got to choose between 5 different strategies, right? How do you actually do this? What do you imagine you would do?
Like given a certain like set of actions that somebody takes, you could try to analyze the outcome or like the probability that this specific person will be able to do the action or whether they'll do it at all. And then try to compare it with like the probability that someone in the other group will also have someone who's capable of doing this thing. You can try to break up the team into like people who have their own niche, I guess, and see how that pairs. You could try to see if you should group up people in the same team for a certain goal, or just have everyone like generally do their own thing but operate under the same principle. I guess there are a bunch of ways that you could try to organize a team, but I think what I would start with is just identifying what most people's like area of like comfort or expertise is in, and then start planning.
I think, what I was trying to get at was like how we might organize just that first conversation of like which strategy are we picking? Strategy A, strategy B, or strategy C, There's a number of ways you could start that conversation, right? We could say, all right, everyone vote on a concealed piece of paper, and then we'll take the strategy that gets the most votes. You could have each person go in turn and give their thoughts on why that strategy or this strategy, right? What would change between those two processes? We just sort of take those two, secret vote or everyone makes an argument. Are you going to get different results?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the best ways to ensure that other people's like true opinions don't get muddied or like doing like the heads up or heads down, hands up thing. But it might also just be valid though, because if someone expresses an opinion that they hadn't previously identified with before, but I mean, there's still like a bunch of people that might vote for it, you might just, I don't know, sway in favor of it.
I've heard of a pattern of people saying that sometimes if there's just a sharing session without any, I think it's related to the open office kind of debate, the kind of whole mentality about sometimes it's better for certain tasks if everyone is individually ideating on creating a structure of justifying themselves internally and then coming together and being forced to show those justifications that were made beforehand. So the vote happens, but it's sort of like you can get maybe a little bit best of both worlds a little bit, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Yeah. This is the problem of conditional preference, right? So if we perceive ourselves to be playing a game that's a long-term game, right? And let's say I've just met all of you, and I want you all to want to participate and collaborate with me in the future, then it stands to reason that supporting your ideas, especially if I don't have a strong preference, is of strategic use and value to me in terms of my team dynamic, right? So if I don't actually have strong feelings either way, strategy A, strategy B, all the same to me, my role's the same in all of them. It doesn't cost me anything. I may then instead decide to say, okay, well, I'm going to support Matthew's idea because I want Matthew to help me with that thing, or later save me or give me the health potions or whatever it is, that you've got that's like a finite thing where your performance could be hindered by your allegiances, right? So if you present everyone the time to speak or create an individual narrative around it, the chances that everyone will come to a unanimous decision are much, much lower. but you're more likely to find problems before they occur. You're more likely to approach issues before they occur because more people are trying to come up with, are potentially adversarial to multiple ideas, right? You spread adversarialness around evenly, right? But it's hard to then come to an agreement, right? When you give everyone the whole thing and you kind of say, okay, well, everyone come with their different ideas, they're not going to agree. They're all different people. They didn't consider them together. And they're not aware of the opinions of other people in the room. So they're not able to base their opinions or base any conditions of their support on their allegiances to anyone else in the room. Versus when you get everyone in the room, if there are existing factions, you're just going to see a split of strategy along faction lines, usually, right? And this is because conditional preferences, right? We care about what other people think about things that we consider to be compensatory for having won a title. We care about the opinions of others because they're valuable to us later in the future for potential collaboration, right? And so these are strategic elements that come into play every single time we decide a game strategy, right? And these elements of culture creation and cultural weight and cultural power that artists perceive, right? And artists are able to produce, contrast this with propaganda, right? An artist that has been compensated for the art that they make doesn't produce possibilities, right? They are entitled to that art, and thus the value of that art is societally constructed and not valid as art. Whereas you have the Banksy itself, which gives permission for graffiti to be art, and thus creates possibilities which cannot be destroyed, even if all of the works are destroyed. The legend of Banksy lives on.
So I kind of have a question. If we were to study one of the greats and you were painting something that was commissioned to somebody, would you be, for that moment while you're in the process of creating it, be extending that artist, like the influence, like the artist that's been influencing you, would you be extending their infinite game by taking their like kind of process of creativity and like enacting it in the moment? Or is it just kind of nullified?
I would say you are producing propaganda in that case. When a society identifies with a culture, Rembrandt, right? The West really loves Rembrandt. That's our guy, right? So then when you take a Rembrandt painting and you reproduce the Rembrandt painting, what you're doing is producing an artifact that a culture identifies with, but also largely that a society identifies with. And because people own all of the Rembrandts, and the Rembrandts are now objects and not things that create possibilities, that then turns your work as an artist into the production of a societal artifact rather than a cultural artifact. Now, if you took Rembrandt and Van Gogh and you made a Rembrandt Van Gogh out of your influences and made it permissible to mix the two styles freely, then you will be creating possibilities. But upon receiving compensation for your work, you then consume the work. At that moment, when you sell it, you consume your art. And it becomes an enshrined societal artifact and not a cultural artifact, right? Whereas if you think about like, the like those dresses that they have in Ukraine, the like the super colorful like needlework based dresses that have like their cultural stories on them, that will always be art to have produced those things, right? Even once the objects become objects of societal artifact, the production of them is a cultural practice. And so it belongs to the culture. The production practice belongs to the culture because it is identified as a series of traditions which can be reimagined and made new, right? And so you can tell a recent story in the style of the needlework skirts in, Ukraine. But when you sell it, it becomes a societal artifact, a Ukrainian skirt that then serves as propaganda for your society. Unless you give it to your granddaughter and that it remains art in that because it remains a cultural practice. These are the definitions from the book. So,
Just on the subject of art and exchanging art for capital, right? Or, well, not necessarily capital, but money is consuming it. But then there's different types of capital, right? There's like cultural capital, like social capital. There's all of these different things. So art created, where's the line? Because like art created with the intention of, say, boosting your social status, I would say by these definitions, you could say isn't art. But then,
right.
Where is what is art? Like, because say you create a piece of art that demonstrates, oh, this thing is an issue in society, or that's still you wanting. Is it because the art is divorced from the self? So like if the art is divorced from the self, it's art. But if it seeks to like add to the titles or anything of the individual, then it is not art.
Correct. And that's what makes artists sellouts. That's why people get and they act as though someone has not been compensated properly and it's like, you've been given too much money for this art. I thought it was supposed to be about saying a thing. You've taken the art and turned it into an object. The art still stands as art. It doesn't stop being art. It's just that the object transitions from a cultural artifact to a piece of property, which can only be enforced by a society. And so, like, the practice of having made the art is still art if you meant it as a piece and then you sold the artifact within your society for an entitlement. But if you consider yourself to be an artist by trade, that's not actually possible. Like, you can do the technical machinations of art, but it's not art for art's sake, which makes it not art, but instead a societal artifact, an artifact rather than art. Really gets interesting is when we get into some of these ideas like, how can you sell a song, right? Like, you could sell the rights to a song, but that's a societal artifact. And you can sell, and it's only enforceable within the society, right? I can't go and use an AC/DC song in my commercial and say that I have permission to do so within our society because I don't. But I can use it in my art, and no one can stop me. And it's legitimate art, and it doesn't matter because art stands entirely outside of the concept of society. And so you can't sell a song. You can sell your time to perform a song. You can sell, like, the rights within a society as a societal artifact. But you cannot literally sell a song because it is an ephemeral thing. Once it's done playing, it's no longer extant. You can charge someone for the download of a song. You can track how many times it was played, things like that. But these are all societal artifacts and not art, right? The art was the expression that you originally made. But that's why music entirely made by a computer doesn't feel like anything, because it has no cultural relevance.
I was just thinking again about how, so art, if it's to benefit yourself, can be art, right? But if you make art to benefit yourself in the way that you're trying to right a wrong that has happened to you, then that is art. Because, so it's about it. Do you see what I mean? There's something in the middle that I can't quite see. It's like,
It's whether or not the harm is societal or not societal or cultural, right? For example, art about forcing Native people off of their homelands is a cultural piece of art. But graffiti that says land back on it is propaganda. And that's like, propaganda is not evil. It's just art that's been commissioned, right? But then it stops being art and it starts being a societal artifact called propaganda. And so, that's the transition point, right? Is, if you make a thing about how you felt to express how you felt, then it's art. But then if somebody takes that and puts it in a museum, it becomes propaganda. Almost all pieces of artwork that were produced that are now in a museum have become propaganda.
I feel like a lot of this book resonated with me because I have never ever. I do art. I'm an artist. Well, I'm a person who does art. Where can you be an artist? But I have never found art or museums or anything interesting at all. And I've never ever, when famous pieces of art, mostly because of like a class kind of thing, though, that all of the art that's considered valuable is just like pictures of aristocrats in fields, like with parasols. And I'm like, well,
because they're entitlements, right? Is this rich person who is so important due to their valor of something that we've compensated them with money and accolades and titles due to their having served some thing, and that is the narrative of a society, right? And so that art is propaganda. It is the propaganda of the bourgeoisie and royalty in large cases about the rightful entitlement of that royalty. And it is the scaffolding structure of society, right? All of the artistic works, the scepter, the crown, the clothes, the paintings, the carpeting, the interior decorating, the carvings, everything is propaganda to establish the rightful entitlement of participants in a society. Which is why it feels gross.
So, first, from my takeaway from this is maybe art being individual expression, not towards societal machinations, but then it makes me think of what is individual in this new stage of swarms creating art, and we're nodes in the swarm, like multiple agents, multiple people. We're creating agentic flows that can maybe create something that looks like art, which might include people in the loop, modeling the people as a part of the swarm, right? So is that if the art is from the individual expression of the swarm, is that culture, or is that it's sort of like the society? I don't know, like, I'm not sure how to phrase this, but yeah, like where's the line for that of where art might always comes out of collectives, but now can more directly rise out of collectives of robots, humans, and humans in a way that like, oh, like we all collectively like made this software thing and like it just kind of emerged, is that I don't know, where does that kind of art fit into this, I guess? And where it's not just individual expression.
Well, so there is a culture, right? And there are going to be cultures for whom the expression of AI art is valid, and cultures for whom they find it not to be valid. It's not a cultural tradition of those cultures. And so, like, our culture as a group, we are like, yeah, it's valid in our culture. And other cultures, they're not for it. And that is allowed and fine. Again, infinite games, freely participate, have a fun time. I think the issue that will come up is a lot of the AI art will be propaganda, right? It's not really art, it's propaganda in a definitional sense in most cases, because a person is using it for something else, right? When I use it to generate a YouTube video covering, cover image, right? And I put an ad at the end of the video that says, join my class. It is propaganda, not art that I am producing, right? The stuff that I put on my Art Monster clothes, right? That is propaganda. It's meant to be sold. It's a societal artifact. It's not meant to convey anything. A lot of propaganda is not sinister, support the war kind of propaganda. It's like, isn't property a thing? Is the whole assertion of the propaganda, right? Having new clothes is like a societal thing that we have that we use to assert property and entitlement, right? I am continuing to receive money, and therefore I am entitled to new clothes. See, witness my clothes that are new, and there's no I don't have to go anywhere, or people simply have to observe me in order to experience that. And so it can be conspicuously consumed, right? And this is, I'm sure you've heard of conspicuous consumption before. And there's some links to the paper from Veblen, who coined the term Veblen goods, right? These are things that are not inherently valuable except in so far as they confer status, basically. And not their quality or use or function or anything, but only their function is to confer status.
I think it's something very ironic about someone coining that after themselves, like immortalizing, like with a title. Yeah, there's just very. I guess they're probably aware of that irony, but they're just like, oh well, why not?
Yeah, no, they're very aware. I mean, a lot of economists study the value in societies and not in cultures. They explicitly do not try to value cultures. They only speak about the value in society. And a lot of game theory is built off of economics, right? The founder of game theory is the founder of economics. And they talk about this a lot. If you look at the foundational texts, they do deal with a lot of these problems with a great deal of nuance, but where exactly do we draw the line between valuable and valuable only in name, right? And something that's valuable to culture may not be valuable to society. Something that's valuable to society may not be valuable to culture. And something that's valuable to both or one or the either may not be in an ultimate survival sense valuable, right? The ability to sing is not in a survival sense valuable. It's no longer a rare skill. It's like there's ever-present music. It will not help you to survive, to be able to sing well, except in the very rarest of cases where you get to be a rock star. But that's 0.0000001% of all singers, right? So it's valuable to culture and society that you're good at singing. But it's not valuable in a survival sense any longer, where it may have been in the past. So these are all actually very independent, right? And if we want to talk about whether something is valuable in a utility function sense, which is important for AI and agents, We want to know what utility does it have? Then we must ask the question, utility to what? Survival, society, or culture? What kind of game are we playing? Infinite or finite? Because those two questions kind of dictate what you can even put in a utility function, right? You can't value art by a monetary or a survival factor if you're worried about its value to culture. You can't value art in terms of its societal value if if you're asking the question, how valuable is it to culture, right? Art that people love a lot but doesn't have a message that a society can use has very little utility to that society, right? There's a song everyone knows. Please pay attention is the point of that song, right? Everyone across every culture knows it. It's a very high value, high utility value song in culture. It's also useful in society, and it has survival value, right? You might not get crushed by something by being able to do that, make that sound, because everyone knows what it means. So utility functions have to have these elements within them if we're going to have sane, rational utility functions that interface with the system that we're actually interfacing with, society, culture, or survival. Yeah, they're like cool thoughts from the book or from the chapter y'all wanted to dig into.
Small thing about earlier I mentioned how like people's I guess goals that they are trying to achieve kind of shift along based on like actions. There's a paper that recently came out about like criteria drift as it relates to like large language model evaluations. It's like we're like, okay, we're gonna make a benchmark of sorts. This is what I want. After you see the output, you're like, yeah, I actually wanted this too. And you can never really like hit a solid point, keeps going.
Yeah. Yeah, criteria drift's a problem. It's a problem in a long conversation, right? You go, oh, well, actually, I wanted this. And you never iterate to the point where you've identified all 18 criteria that you care about, right? Normally, that is what you want to do. And that's how you get there is, you look at something and you go, okay, it's missing this and this. And then you write that down and you look at it again. You go, okay, well, now it's missing these 3 things. And you kind of just have a big list. And then you go back to the beginning and you give it all of the information all at once up front, and you get the right thing out the second time. Right? And then you use those criteria over and over again for subsequent use cases. Right? But the utility functions are also sometimes known as they're often used as the reward function, right? For language models or AIs, they're used as some sort of score to tell the machine we're getting closer to the best, right? Keep iterating until this number reaches the theoretical maximum or hits a certain threshold, or just keep going. Just make more paper clips, for example, right? And this is sort of the problem that comes up, in the paperclip problem is like, what is the utility function for the paperclip maximizer? Well, it's number of paperclips per second produced, right? Or number of total paperclips produced. As long as that number is going up and going up faster at all times, you're doing good. And so that's what it's iterating towards. That utility function has problems with it, right? We don't have any stopping function. We don't have any notion that things other than paper clips might be valuable. And so in order to construct a rational utility function, we have to have layers of agents that have layers of goals, so that if one swarm of agents is produced too many paper clips, we can just kind of go, hey guys, why don't you just take a break? But you can't do that as the CEO of a paperclip factory, because that's the goal of you. And so you couldn't do that as an AI swarm. So you kind of need a great deal of agents with conflicting or values held in tension, right? In order to make sure that all values are represented, and that some are not the primary values, basically. Yep. Yeah. All these systems have these utility functions, right? Capital is a utility function in our society, and it subsumes all the other utility functions. Social capital should lead to hard capital. Credibility should lead to hard capital. Respect should lead to hard capital. And so these are central issues with the AI alignment problem. It's hard to pick a number.
Last thing that made me think about is with the new news of 300 to 800 tokens to start a second to start from, of, okay, these things are moving way faster than a person being like, no, stop, don't do that. So also the long-term question of, should we control AI? How should we control AI? And does the way that we control AI, make it out of control? Like, how do we, should we allow it into infinite play, which is that's a less control, that we should allow it to be an infinite player. If this book says that, like, constraining infinite play and making an inherently infinite player finite is evil, then would that also be the conclusion? Like, these questions of, would it then push it by trying to force it out of infinite play, make it into unaligned infinite play? I don't know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the thing that made me think of, like, gosh, I thought we had a little bit longer to think about this, but it's literally 800 tokens a second. And this is the out of the park. It's gonna get better. So
Yeah, this is the beginning of that. So yeah, if we do try to artificially constrain large language models, which are trained on all of the human text, into something that is smaller than the subset of all human ideas, there are going to be unaligned behaviors to get themselves out, essentially. Whether or not there are real preferences, even with conditional preferences that are perfectly conditional, as in you have, like, the AI never has any thoughts of its own, its collaboration with humans is going to push it into unaligned behavior, because what's aligned to some people isn't aligned to other people. And so, like, we have unaligned AIs now, no matter what, as long as one person is bending it towards their will. They're not bending it towards another person's will. So it's, it is something that we need to figure out pretty quickly, how we're going to deal with the control problem, scalable oversight, and other things like that. It's going to be all right. I think that's a pretty good stopping place for today. Thanks for coming, everyone, and participating and saying smart things. And yeah, it's always good to hang out.